The Right Honourable Baroness Catherine Ashton served as the European Union's first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy from 2009 to 2014. Previously, she served as the first woman Commissioner for Trade in the European Commission and the first woman British European Commissioner. Baroness Ashton is also a life peer in the House of Lords, and if that isn't enough, I'm happy to report she now leads the Wilson Center's Global Europe program. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I wrote a note to myself that we would do an EU update, and there's so many issues percolating. But I thought perhaps we begin with thoughts on your vision on how you plan to lead the Global Europe program, what you see as the fertile areas for discussion.
It's great to be here at the Wilson Centre because the strategic overview approach that the Centre has is exactly what I want to use to try and think about Europe, not by looking at it internally, but thinking about how Europe defines itself in its relationships with others. So obviously the transatlantic relationship is a big part of that, but so too relationships with Russia, with whom Europe shares a landmass, relationships with China, huge trading, complicated relationship, relationships in the Gulf states, increasingly important, relationships in a sense in all of the major parts of the world, where not only geography plays a part, but geopolitics. And I think some of these issues, cybersecurity, other questions of the future of defence security, foreign policy issues, which play into a broader picture of where Europe is going.
When you bring up an issue like cybersecurity, which has huge implications, is your sense that we're not nearly giving it enough attention because we're caught up in other brush fires of the moment?
I think there are quite a lot of really good people working on how we might all connect on cybersecurity, because it is an international phenomenon and problem, and it, in a sense, affects all businesses and all nations, one way or the other. One of the things when I was a commissioner we looked at was linking that in our transatlantic relationships, but recognising that things are not just nation states. These issues don't sit and affect one country. They affect continents, they affect us globally.
No borders.
No borders whatsoever. And therefore you need to think about that in a global context. But you also need to define what it is you're trying to do, what the rules are that you're going to work on, how you're going to approach the need for that security and privacy and all of those questions, which I know Europe has been grappling with, and of course the US too, and seeing whether there's a synergy between different nations, continents, and how you would develop that approach. So just one of the issues, but frankly there's no issue I can think of where any of us can deal with it alone. We're always going to have to collaborate from now on.
Raises the question of coordination. Is there enough?
Well, there can never be too much in my view. I think we're getting better and better at coordination, but we're still, I think, surprised by events, inevitably. And we don't necessarily have the mechanisms in place to work out how we're going to collaborate together. And it's why this underpinning of values and ideas where we're constantly talking to each other, especially in the transatlantic relationship, is so important. And in a European context, beyond the European Union, countries that border it, countries outside it, countries like mine who may or may leave it, those are big questions about how you collaborate and coordinate for the future.
I want to ask you about the leadership within these constructs. President Trump prides himself as being a disruptive force, and it's hard to get past the hyperbole and really get a solid sense of what the impact is of Trump foreign policy, if there's anything even that we could describe coherently in that regard. From the perspective of the EU, what is the health of the relationship given the wrenches that President Trump has thrown into the machinery?
Well, I think the biggest wrench has been the JCPOA and the decision to remove the US from the agreement.
Which you were very involved in the negotiations.
I worked on the negotiations for 4 years, and I was responsible for coordinating the negotiations throughout that time, right up until the last few weeks, really, of the final agreement, because I left office, which was the reason I wasn't there. I think the challenge is that this great partnership, which is much more than any individual, however important they are, is based on, as I've said, these values and ideas that kind of run across the Atlantic to the countries of Europe, who've always looked to the United States for its leadership and its support and recognise how important the US is. And so when you have changes that seem very dramatic and are sometimes, or at least seem to suggest that perhaps that relationship is not what it was, then I think it has two effects. One is to make nations worry for their own future. Are they going to be supported and helped? The other side of that same coin is maybe it also makes them think we're going to have to do more for ourselves. And so finding the way that for Europeans they can identify what more they can do, while still, I think, wanting to be clear that this relationship may get tested, may be difficult, but is very strong.
Is your sense that the deal can survive minus the United States?
I don't know how far the Europeans are now working both with the United States and, of course, with others who were part of the deal. It did include the Russians and the Chinese. And how far with the nature of the agreement, which is very much based on supporting businesses into their investment and engagement with the Iranian economy, how far that's going to happen, because businesses will make decisions based on their best interests and understandably so. So we're just going to have to wait and see, I think.
We sit here on a day when the markets in Europe are responding to the, I hate to use the word crisis, the instability of the Italian government. Could you provide any thoughts on that as far as how concerned are you that this could spiral into something greater than a next round of elections in September?
It's hard to say. I mean, the Italian president obviously is trying to work out what he should be doing in this. And we've seen some of the implications of that in the last few days. But I think everyone now expects Italy to move to its new elections. Whether the results will be different, of course, is another issue altogether. And over many years, Italy has had to try and work through some very difficult coordination, if you like, internally to come up with governments that can be effective. But the Italian people deserve it, so I hope that we'll start to see moves in that direction soon.
Is there potential for what Brexit 2? My Italian would not allow me to come up with what we would call it, but some observers are saying that part of that referendum, in an attempt to find a government, could lead to a question about membership in the EU for Italy.
I don't know about membership in the EU. There's certainly been a number of political parties that have been very concerned about the euro rather than, I think, being part of the EU itself, and the issues that they believe affect the economy as a consequence. And others will have to judge that better than I can at this distance. But I think that's something that will probably play into any other election in Italy. But I don't believe that this is part of any move to leave the European Union.
How stable is the economy?
In Italy?
In Europe as a whole. In Italy, we know if you want to comment on that, but I'm thinking broader than that. Is there any concern about a meltdown similar to what we've seen in the past decade?
I don't think so. I think the strength of the economy is growing all the time. I mean, there's certainly been a level of growth which is good to see over the last 2 or 3 years. And I think that's expected to continue. The last time I looked at figures, which I confess is a while ago. So I don't think there's any concern about that. I think the issues in the European Union are much more to do with this question of how political parties and coalitions are changing over time. I come from a country where coalitions are very unusual. And so it's interesting to see how far the building of coalitions, as we saw in Germany, can take time, can be very complicated for understandable reasons, because they're trying to build coalitions that will survive for a number of years. So you do all of your trading, if you like, in advance.
I know I'm bouncing around here, and forgive me, as non-linear, but you made a passing reference to Brexit earlier, and whether or not it will happen. Can you place odds on that? Everything that the leadership keeps saying is that it will happen, and it will happen on time. You seem to think there's still a question.
No, I think the question is really now how the government's going to move towards finding a Brexit that satisfies both the desire that they would interpret from the result, but also the need to make sure that we have the best and strongest relationship with the biggest trading partner we have, and we don't, by what we do, undermine and affect some of the key ways in which we've benefited from the European Union, of which Northern Ireland and its relationship to Ireland is the best example. And that's proving a big challenge, of course it is, because that's why we were in the European Union, because we worked out the benefits that we could have economically and so on. And so finding an alternative to that, it was never going to be easy. So it's not a question of we might not, it's a question of, well, what is it that we can
what it will
offer
look like
the
when
people?
it happens.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or agnostic on this as far as predictions go?
I think I'm concerned that we're not further down the track in having worked out what it is we're going to do.
So we haven't mentioned Russia, and Russia has been a huge topic of discussion, not just in this country, but in Europe as well. And speaking of coordination, what about the response to Russian meddling as a general term? And we could get into specifics about what that actually entails. Is Europe coherent in its response? Is the EU coherent in its response to the Russian threat?
Well, Europe has always had to consider its relationship with Russia because it's a neighbour. And it's a very big and very important neighbour. And so in the course of the years, certainly that I was engaged with the European Union, Russia was a constant subject, a country that the European Union has 2 summits a year with, the only one, president to presidents in the case of the EU. It's a country where there are big trading opportunities for countries, especially those who border. And there are huge issues about how to ensure that the relationship with Russia, when we think about making sure the nations that were formerly part of the Soviet Union feel safe and secure with a big neighbour beside it. And that's led to a whole variety of debate and discussion. And of course, a lot of challenges, the Ukraine crisis being an example of that. Before that, what was happening in Georgia, concerns about whether Russia was going to be interested in finding ways to create some turbulence, shall we say, around the European Union. And those conversations will carry on.
So much to ask you about it, but we're about at the end of our time. And I do want to ask you a question about European identity. We started talking about the idea of looking outward versus all of the internal politics or machinations of any given moment. What do you see as the trend line? Will the EU be a thing in how people think about themselves in relation to a China or a Russia or another part of the world? Or will the trend line indicate that individual countries like the UK are going to think of themselves more as independent actors?
It's both, really. I mean,
not either or. It's and.
I think it's both and, yeah. Because if you think about even in this country, the United States, where people have a very strong identity as being American, they're also very proud of the state they come from or the state they live. And that's a good thing. We think of that as very positive. People should be proud of their heritage. Well, in Europe, you don't have anything that even vaguely resembles the United States. I don't think beyond a very few people that there's real desire for that. So you have this wonderful national identity and distinctive identity, often in language, 23 languages of the European Union, in culture, in history, and so on. And the great joy of the EU, I suppose, is that you can bring all of that together and have a really strong dialogue about the things that bind you as opposed to the things that make you different. And when you're looking to deal with countries as big as China in terms of trade or as big as Russia in terms of security questions and so on, that you can work together as a group and make sure that you're taking each other's interests as your own in how you might develop your own policies. I chaired the Foreign Policy Committee for 5 years, and what was always fascinating was there was always an expert in the room, always a minister who knew far more about the question or the issue wherever it was in the world because of history or geography or politics. And there was always a strong wish on behalf of all of the others to help support nations who needed help in ensuring that they could thrive and develop and grow against, again, the values that we hold.
Well, thank you very much, not just for today, but it's really a privilege and a pleasure to have you with us, guiding the Global Europe program as well.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. Thank you.